Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I am truly honored, and I'm afraid to say humbled, to be following such a distinguished speaker as Thorvald Stoltenberg. He has become a friend and an advisor, and I'm not sure how I'm supposed to follow that act. And I'm happy to yield some of my time, if necessary, to you, perhaps I have already done that, I think. I'm not quite sure, and I'm not sure that I really want to compete with you. I haven't been up here 63 times. I'll tell you, in the 2 years I've been here 4 times, and love it each time I come. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share with you the U.S. perspectives on the Arctic. The Arctic is a fascinating area, and as the United States Ambassador to the Kingdom of Norway, I've had the pleasure, as I said, of visiting the High North, both here in Norway and in Russia. I've seen life in the Arctic up close in Svalbard and Tromsø, Kirkenes, Karasjok, Alta, Murmansk, just to name a few of the places that I've had the chance to visit. I've talked with people in the Arctic about issues in everyday life that they face. Now, there was a moment when I was in the midst of a herd of reindeers. I wasn't too clear that I wasn't up too close to the Arctic life. But it was very interesting. But I can say I've thoroughly enjoyed visiting here and experiencing the High North, and I'm very pleased to return again today. I'd like to discuss how the U.S. views the Arctic, including Arctic energy development and how we look and work with Norway and other partners in the Arctic Council. While I'm not an expert on all the technical details of what happens in the Arctic Council, I'll do my best to give you a general U.S. perspective on Arctic issues. And the one thing I want to emphasize, and I think the U.S. has emphasized this from the beginning, that it's an area for cooperation and not competition. It's been getting a lot of attention recently, especially in Norway, and deservedly so. It's experiencing a change in result of climate change, ecologically sensitive areas. There's a potential for new transit routes, new responsible resource utilization, and an area of extensive international cooperation. It seems that too often the concept of a race to the Arctic is bandied about, whether in the popular press or in a number of recently published books. While these make for interesting reading, neither the United States government nor certainly the Norwegian government, according to Minister Storr, believe that we are in the middle of a race to the Arctic. That is to say, there are real, large changes happening in the Arctic, but many of these changes are unfolding over a period of decades. We have strong international institutions and systems to manage these processes, and we all have a common interest in preserving the Arctic areas even as we pursue sustainable development. Thus, we fundamentally agree with Norway's philosophy of high north, low tension. In fact, peaceful cooperation in low tension has been the norm in the Arctic. The member countries of the Arctic Council took a huge step forward last spring when they signed the Search and Rescue Agreement. The Arctic states are now working on oil spill preparedness and response measures together. In general, the long and successful joint fisheries management programs between Russia and Norway are a model of cooperation and responsible management, even if there are an incident or two that occur on the way. As further evidence for how problems are solved peacefully and calmly, we congratulate Norway and Russia on the successful conclusion of 40 years of negotiation on the Barents Delimitation Agreement, which has now been implemented. I was in Washington on the night that the agreement was announced. I was with Ambassador Vega Stroman, and he mentioned to the room that 24 years ago, when he was a young pup working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he actually worked on that agreement as a lawyer. So sometimes these things take a long time in the making, but they are worthwhile, a lot of patience and cooperation. And I would argue that, as I've said, there is no competition for resources or the race to the Arctic, or an Arctic gold rush coming. In fact, the large majority of the known expected oil and gas resources in the Arctic are located in exclusive economic zones of the 5 Arctic coastal states: Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the US. And to the extent discoveries are made in these areas, they will probably be under the national jurisdictions of those coastal states as well, given that all 5 are either mapping or have already mapped their extended coastal shelves. Specialists expect that once these shelves are mapped, there will be very little, if any, unclaimed seabed. The chances of countries other than these 5 coastal states being able to lay claim to any resources on or below the seabed are indeed very slim. So I just wanted to emphasize that sometimes issues of the Arctic can be blown out of proportion when the reality is a story about slow, steady cooperation, and particularly scientific cooperation. As an aside note, many of you may have noticed that the Russians announced a fantastic discovery under the Antarctica today about a deep-sea lake, and I expect that similar kinds of scientific discoveries will be made in the Arctic areas. Now, let's talk about our policy in more detail, the U.S. policy. Let me give you some background that might illuminate the different perspectives that we have than some of the Arctic states. The U.S. is an Arctic nation, and not only because it's home to 4.5 million Norwegians who seem to have the Arctic in their blood, but it's because the Arctic is a nation, we are an Arctic nation because of Alaska. This makes the United States slightly different approach to it than Norway, Russia, or Canada. For many of you, Arctic is really part of a national identity. For most people in the United States, the Arctic is not so visible in everyday life. We have been an Arctic nation since we bought Alaska from Russia in 1867 for the phenomenal price of $7.2 million, which comes out to about 1.7 cents per acre. But it's separate from the lower 48 states, far removed from the vast majority of the U.S. population. I would say there's not much discussion amongst U.S. citizens about the Arctic country that we are. But the government is well aware of the Arctic and has been for decades. It is because of the low-key public view of the Arctic that our government's efforts are largely unnoticed by our public and by the media. You can be assured that we have an interesting election going on, and I've seen that people in Norway seem to be more up to date on what happens in our election than we are. And people sometimes ask me to try to explain what's going on in our election, and there's no rational way that I can explain the Republican primaries. But it will not be part of the issue. You will not hear the word Arctic mentioned at once, I would expect, during this election season. But our government has played a major role since Alaska has come under our jurisdiction. Indeed, Senator Clinton, then Senator Clinton, and Senator McCain visited Svalbard. Before I came out to post, both President Obama and Senator Clinton, Secretary of State, she was then Secretary of State Clinton, mentioned to me that I pay attention to the high north and the Arctic because it was important to them. Like Norway, several U.S. administrations have had formal Arctic policies. In fact, nearly all the Arctic states had developed their own policies over the last several years. The U.S. current Arctic policy was unveiled on January 9, 2009, just before the Bush administration came to an end. This was the first review that the U.S. had made since 1994 and was focused on changes in the Arctic since that time. It was not controversial, and the Obama administration, which came in 11 days after the announcement of that policy, has retained the policy unchanged. The main changes in our policy since 1994 focus on the impacts of climate change in the Arctic, the advent of the Arctic Council, and our evolving global security posture. As everyone here knows, the principal drivers of activity in the Arctic right now and into the future include impact of climate change, which are opening the region more than ever before, increasing human presence in the region as a result of improving accessibility, and the growing demand for Arctic energy and other natural resources. The United States is strongly committed to working with our allies and friends in the Arctic and elsewhere on these common challenges. Our Arctic policy was issued as a comprehensive White House joint directive known as the Security Presidential Directive 66 and Homeland Security Presidential Directive 25, taking into account both national and homeland security interests. And there are 6 overall goals in our policy: protecting the Arctic environment and conserving its biological resources, assuring that natural resource management and economic development in the region are environmentally sustainable, strengthening institutions for cooperation among the 8 Arctic nations, involving the Arctic's indigenous peoples in decisions that affect them, enhancing scientific monitoring and research into local, regional, and global environmental issues, and meeting post-Cold War national security needs. Based on these policies, the United States is actively strengthening the Arctic Council, improving search and rescue coordination, increasing disaster preparedness in the Arctic, taking an ecosystem-based approach to the Arctic environmental management, and dealing with such Arctic challenges as black carbon, which, as I understand it, is just a fancy name for soot that sits on the ice and causes it to melt faster. Up to this point, I've emphasized cooperation in the Arctic because I believe that's the most relevant approach, and it's the reality. However, there are going to be some areas of policy disagreement and opportunities for further discussion, and I thought I might raise a couple of those issues. First, just to get it out of the way, and I'm always asked about this, UNCLOS. I'm always asked, why has the United States not endorsed that? You're familiar with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States has not ratified this. I want to be very clear about this. The Obama administration supports ratifying it. The Bush administration supported it. Secretary Clinton supports it. The Department of Defense supports it. Our top military leaders are supporting our ratifying it. Many commercial interests have supported ratifying it. Most of the Democrats in the Senate have done it. Most of the Republicans would be in favor of supporting it. So why haven't we ratified it? Good question. Our politics sometimes are hard to explain. We do have a very conservative form of government that people don't always recognize. It takes a lot to get done. We protect the minority rights. There are some members of our Senate who are concerned about ceding sovereignty to a United Nations type organization. And there are some other objections to the treaty. The good news is, ratified or not, the United States abides by the treaty. In fact, as I look at it, we sort of get the worst of all worlds. We abide by it and the restrictions that it imposes on it. We've yet to be able to make claims to land under the sea because we had not been part of the treaty. We do hope the Obama administration would like to see it ratified. I know that Senator John Kerry, who is my senator from Massachusetts, would like to see it. He's the head of the Foreign Policy Committee. But with an election year pending, it's not likely that it will be ratified this year. But hopefully, if the president is reelected, we may see action on it next year. Transit routes. The U.S. believes that both the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage are international straits. U.S. and Canada disagree over the status of the Northwest Passage, and U.S. and Russia disagree over the status of the Northern Sea Route. I would note that although there are fundamental disagreements based on legal interpretations of certain principles, these controversies have existed for decades, and they really have not caused major problems, and we don't foresee them causing major problems in the future. The Arctic Council, that's the forum where the U.S. conducts much of our Arctic diplomacy. It is undergoing important changes that are intended to strengthen relationships among the member states and permanent participants, indigenous groups, and improve our collective ability to respond to the rapid changes taking place in the Arctic. Sweden is doing a superb job as the two-year chair and is introducing new ideas such as corporate social responsibility and resilience to environmental and social change. It is also leading the process of creating a new standard secretariat to be based in Tromsø, which we hope will be up and running at the beginning of the Canadian Championship in May of 2013. Having a standing secretariat will not only provide support to each country's chairmanship, but will also allow for more corporate memory and stability during the transition between chairmanships. For our part, the U.S. is co-chairing with Sweden and Iceland an experts group on ecosystem-based management that we hope will positively affect how each of the Arctic states manages its land and marine areas. The U.S., Norway, and Russia are co-chairing a task force to negotiate an agreement on oil spill preparedness and response, so that we can be better prepared for offshore oil and gas development and increased bulk oil shipments in the future and incidents that, unfortunately, probably may occur. Each of these initiatives will strengthen Arctic governance and contribute to good cooperation in the region. Okay, good. Indigenous people, the Arctic Council. I want to emphasize the importance of involving indigenous peoples in decisions that affect them. One reason why the U.S. generally prefers to operate within the Arctic Council rather than to hold discussions among the so-called Arctic 5 coastal states is that the Arctic Council has well-established procedures to allow the indigenous peoples to be heard through the permanent participation status. Alaska Natives play an important role in developing U.S. Arctic policy, and we want to ensure that indigenous peoples from the entire circumpolar region have input into decisions that will likely have a great impact on them. They live in the Arctic after all. They have a lot of expertise to contribute to the discussions about the region. Norway and the Arctic. Like the United States, Norway sees the Arctic as an area of cooperation and stability. Its environmental fragility is highlighted by the impact of rapid climate change, but it's also a potentially large source of energy and other natural resources. Norway recently has done a great job in offering support to the Sami and the voice of the Arctic indigenous peoples. Norway stresses that the Arctic Council and the Barents Europe Arctic Council are forums where indigenous peoples' interests can be safeguarded and developed. I recently had the opportunity to visit the Sami Parliament, and I can tell you it's a little bit different than the U.S. Parliament, the U.S. Congress, and perhaps the Norwegian Storting. They actually attended the sessions and listened. And if you go into the room, they're all there. You go to our Congress, and like sometimes you're Storting, you see the speaker, and that's it. They were there, and they were paying attention. Norway's efforts in the areas of scientific research on Svalbard are also impressive. Many countries have established research stations there, and many scientists from the U.S. spend time on Svalbard making important contributions to our understanding of the Arctic, climate, oceans, and space. Norway's recent white paper underlines the knowledge that is at the core of the High North policy. The United States is very committed to supporting scientific research. The white paper also addresses national defense. Norway has moved its national joint headquarters to Bodø, and Norway conducts joint exercises with other countries. I don't want to get into that Bodø debate and locating of our great F-35s, but I'll leave that to Norway to figure that one out. Norway has exercises with NATO, with the U.S., with Sweden, Finland, and with Russia. As human activity increases in the High North, we would expect to see even more cooperation. Norway, like the U.S., with Alaska, will face challenges in developing natural resources in the Arctic, such as petroleum, natural gas, but the new boundary delimitation agreement has removed an important obstacle to developing the Barents Sea as a new energy province. As the strategy points out, this development must be balanced with concern for environment and indigenous peoples. However, unlocking oil and natural gas potential in this area can contribute to the well-being both of Norway and to European energy security. In 2008, the U.S. Geological Survey released a circum-Arctic resource appraisal on conventional hydrocarbon reserves in the Arctic. These resources account 22% of the undiscovered, technically recoverable resources in the world. The Arctic accounts for about 13% of all undiscovered oil, 30% of the undiscovered natural gas, 20% of the undiscovered natural gas liquids in the world. It is truly a terrific opportunity. Energy development in the Arctic is expected to play a significant role in the future. Arctic nations must balance access and development of energy and natural resources with protection of the Arctic environment by ensuring that continental shelf resources are managed in a responsible manner. We will continue working closely with other Arctic nations through the Arctic Council and other forums to ensure this. Okay. I've had the privilege of getting to know the vibrant oil industry here. I've visited an oil platform. In fact, I had an opportunity to shoot a basketball in one of the platforms, and I sent that picture to the president. He was quite intrigued by it. He's a big basketball fan. I don't know that I can get him out here to an oil platform. He has visited Norway once, as I'm sure you all know, but we'll see if we can get him back. But I've been impressed with the high level of technology and competence, particularly in the face of Arctic conditions at some facilities. Norway's white paper on petroleum sector policy communicated a strong commitment to high activity levels. This is an important and well-received signal for U.S. operators and supply companies on the Norwegian continental shelf. The U.S. supports continued environmentally sustainable oil and gas exploration and development on the shelf and congratulates Norway on its successes in exploring the North and the Barents Sea over the last year. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that I think that Norway is on the right track with its policy of high north, low tension, and an approach to the Arctic. Many interesting things are happening in the Arctic. It's an area of dramatic change. But it's also an area of cooperation and model for many other parts of the world. And I can assure you that the United States has been and will continue to be paying a great deal of attention to that area. Thank you very much.